When Susan Chen received the certified letter summoning her to Morrison and Associates, she assumed it was about her taxes. Instead, she found herself seated across from a slender man in a navy suit who introduced himself as James Morrison, notary public. The leather chairs creaked in the silence as he retrieved a thick manila envelope from his desk drawer. "Miss Chen, you're here because you were named in Margaret Whitman's will," he said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Susan's heart clenched. She hadn't allowed herself to properly mourn her elderly neighbor's passing 2 weeks ago. "I don't understand. Margaret and I were close, but I'm not family. Nevertheless..." Morrison's fingers traced the envelope's edge. Mrs. Whitman was quite specific about this bequest. She came to me 6 months ago to update her will, and I remember the appointment clearly because of its unusual nature. He withdrew a weathered brass key and several photographs showing a wooden structure nestled deep in forest shadows. "Mrs. Whitman left you her cabin in the Adirondacks." "A cabin?" Susan leaned forward. In all our conversations over coffee, she never mentioned owning property up there. According to the deed, it's been in her possession since 1968. Morrison consulted his papers. Mrs. Whitman emphasized that the cabin was extremely important to her, though she declined to elaborate why. She was adamant that you, specifically, should inherit it. Susan traced the key's worn teeth with her finger. In 4 years of living next door to Margaret, sharing Sunday afternoon teas and helping with her grocery shopping, the elderly woman had never hinted at this part of her life. They'd talked about Margaret's garden, her grandchildren in California, her late husband Edward's career as a history professor, but never about a mysterious cabin in the woods. "The property is about an hour's drive north," Morrison said, providing a set of coordinates and detailed directions. "I suggest you take a look soon. The forecast is calling for heavy rain later this week." As Susan signed the inheritance papers, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than a simple property transfer. Margaret had been sharp as a tack until the end, and she didn't do anything without purpose. The late October afternoon painted the mountains in brilliant reds and golds as Susan's Honda wound through increasingly remote roads. The GPS signal grew spotty as she left civilization behind, forcing her to rely on Morrison's hand-drawn map for the final stretch. She parked where the dirt road ended and consulted the coordinates. The cabin lay 2 miles ahead through dense forest. As Susan hiked the worn trail, her mind wandered to Margaret. She'd first met the elderly woman shortly after moving to the neighborhood 4 years ago. Margaret had appeared at her door with a loaf of homemade zucchini bread and a warm smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. Despite their 50-year age difference, they'd formed an immediate connection. Margaret shared stories of her travels while Susan helped her navigate modern technology. But now, Susan wondered how much of her friend she'd really known. The cabin emerged from the trees like a forgotten memory. Weather-worn logs showed patches of rot, and several windows gaped empty. The tin roof had partially collapsed on one side. Susan's architectural training told her the structure dated to the late 1960s, matching when Margaret had acquired it. The brass key turned smoothly in the lock despite years of disuse. The door's hinges protested as Susan stepped inside. Dust motes danced in shafts of afternoon light, filtering through the broken windows. The cabin's single room contained basic furniture draped in yellowed sheets, their shapes humped and ghostly in the dim light. A framed photograph on the mantel caught Susan's eye. She wiped away decades of dust to reveal a much younger Margaret standing with a group of people, all wearing work clothes and holding shovels and other equipment. They looked like an archaeological team. The photo was dated October 1968, the same year Margaret bought the cabin. Susan methodically explored the cabin's interior, her architect's eye noting structural details. The layout was simple but thoughtfully designed, with a small kitchenette and sleeping area. Everything spoke of functionality rather than comfort. This wasn't a vacation home, it had been a workspace. As she paced the room's perimeter, a floorboard creaked differently under her foot. Susan knelt to examine it, finding a small Persian rug covering that section. When she pulled back the fabric, her breath caught. A wooden hatch lay nearly flush with the surrounding floorboards, its presence betrayed only by a recessed metal handle. Susan's hands trembled as she gripped the handle. The hatch resisted, then surrendered with a groan. A wooden ladder descended into darkness. Using her phone's flashlight, Susan carefully climbed down. Her light beam revealed a large underground room, at least twice the size of the cabin above. Metal shelving lined the walls, holding dozens of leather-bound notebooks, maps, and what appeared to be carefully cataloged artifacts in museum-quality storage containers. A massive desk dominated one corner, its surface covered in papers weighted down by rock specimens. "Oh, Margaret," Susan whispered, "what were you working on down here?" The desk drawers yielded a treasure trove of documented evidence. Photographs, detailed maps of the region marked with mysterious symbols, and correspondence spanning decades. As Susan pieced it together, an extraordinary story emerged. In 1968, Margaret had been part of a groundbreaking archaeological survey that discovered evidence of previously unknown Mayan settlements in the region. The find was unprecedented, the northernmost extent of Mayan influence ever recorded. But before the team could properly document and protect the sites, local officials intervened. Artifacts began disappearing, only to resurface years later in private collections or on the black market. Margaret's notes revealed a decades-long investigation into a network of corrupt officials and antiquities traders who had systematically looted the sites. She'd used the cabin as her base of operations, meticulously gathering evidence while maintaining the appearance of a quiet retirement. The final entry was dated just 3 months ago. "My time grows short, but the truth must emerge. I've chosen Susan because I've watched her stand up to the housing board and the city council when they tried to demolish the historic Williams house. She has both courage and integrity. The evidence is ready. It must go to Detective Harris in Essex County. Our local authorities are compromised. Susan will know what to do." A sealed envelope marked "For Susan, Urgent" contained detailed instructions and contact information for Detective Michael Harris of the Essex County Sheriff's Department. The next morning, Susan sat across from Detective Harris, watching him examine Margaret's documentation. His face grew increasingly grave as he paged through decades of evidence. "Mrs. Whitman contacted me several times over the years," he said finally. "But she never had quite enough proof to move forward. This, though." He held up a particularly detailed set of photographs. "This is the smoking gun we needed." Over the next few weeks, Susan watched from the sidelines as Harris's investigation unfolded. The case broke open like a dam. Margaret's evidence implicated 3 former county commissioners, numerous local officials, and even the former police chief in a decades-long scheme to loot and sell priceless Mayan artifacts. The FBI's art crime team joined the investigation, recovering millions in stolen antiquities. The media dubbed it the grandmother's revenge, but Susan knew Margaret would have hated that sensationalist title. Her friend hadn't wanted revenge. She'd wanted justice and preservation of irreplaceable historical treasures. 1 year later, Susan stood in the newly opened Margaret Whitman Wing of the State Archaeological Museum. The exhibit featured carefully preserved artifacts recovered during the investigation, alongside the story of how one determined woman had spent decades building a case to protect her region's archaeological heritage. Susan paused before a photograph of young Margaret with her original survey team. Now she understood why her friend had spent so many hours discussing local history and preservation with her over tea. Margaret had been quietly evaluating her, looking for someone who shared her passion for protecting the past. The cabin key hung on a chain around Susan's neck. She'd renovated the structure, preserving Margaret's research basement as a time capsule while converting the upper level into a workspace for archaeological students. It seemed fitting that new generations would continue the work Margaret had started. In the end, Margaret's greatest gift hadn't been the cabin itself, but the chance to complete her mission. She'd trusted Susan to understand the importance of truth and preservation, to have the courage to see justice done. Standing in the museum named for her friend, Susan knew that trust had not been misplaced. As she left the exhibition, Susan smiled at a quote engraved beside Margaret's photograph. "The past belongs to all of us. We must protect it for those who come after." It was exactly the kind of thing Margaret would say over Sunday tea, direct, profound, and absolutely true.